Unfortunately, the project of doing the three-dimensional structure of immunoglobulins never happened. Jerry was an MD. He had contacts with the cancer doctors in New York and had lots of samples of proteins from the disease multiple myeloma, which is basically a cancer where one of your immune cells replicates in a cancerous fashion and crowds out all the other cells. So if you got a sample, you could get a pure protein that way. And in those days, that was important. But we never succeeded in growing a crystal. So we moved on to other things. I should mention around that time, Jerry also hired Joe Becker, who had just graduated from Stanford as a postdoc, and he and I worked together. We looked around for something else that would be of interest to the lab in immunology and came up with concanavalin A. This was a molecule that came from a bean, so it was easy to go to a food store and buy a bag of beans and do the prep. It had been crystallized in the 1930s by Sumner here at Rockefeller, so it was easy to crystallize. We did the structure. We built what you did in those days before there was any computer graphics. We built a model out of brass components. That model was attached to the wall outside Jerry Edelman's office for many years until he moved to the Scripps in San Diego around the early 1990s. That model moved out with him. As far as I ever knew visiting him, it probably stayed in a closet out there until he passed away a couple of years ago, at which time people in his group offered to have it brought back here if we wanted it. Tom Sackmar, who's now in charge of the instrument collection here, agreed to accept it, and Rockefeller paid for the transportation to bring it back here. I cleaned it up and made sure it was intact, and it's now on display in Casbury Auditorium outside the ladies' bathroom on the lower level, if anyone's interested. It's there now. I worked on other structures at the time, which were the most interesting one probably was beta-2 microglobulin. That was the light chain of various molecules of interest in the immune system, the histocompatibility antigens, and it was the closest thing to the immunoglobulin that we tried to work on. It was personally important for me because after solving that structure and building another one of these models, I gave a lecture in Casbury Auditorium, which led to my receiving tenure here as associate professor. So that was actually the last crystal structure I worked on. I'll say a few words about working with Edelman. There's a lot of things that have been said about him. What I'll say is this: he was full of huge ideas. It was very interesting to work with and introduced me to a lot of very interesting people. But he wasn't that interested in the details, which was good. It meant that if you were in his lab, he kind of left you alone to figure out how to solve a problem. I'll give you one example that I've never forgotten. We had lunch one day and we were talking about music. He played the violin, I played the piano. And he said, when people improvise, sometimes you'd like to get that music recorded in terms of a score. He said, I have a great idea. You put a microphone, you hook it up to a computer, you do maybe a Fourier analysis, you find out what the notes are, the computer can check the time of all the notes and write out a musical score. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, I started thinking, yeah, you'd need an A to D converter, you'd need a Fourier routine. He said, no, we'll get a patent on this and then we'll hire some engineers to do it. I don't care about the details. And so really working with him, the biggest problem was to put your own ideas into something he suggested and actually make some progress on before he came up with the next even better idea. He was very supportive. I know that there were people who touched him the wrong way, and there were various things that I don't think are worth discussing here, but for me it was a very productive and positive experience. It also led to my changing fields to work in neuroscience, so let me say a little bit about that. I was, of course, discouraged that we had not gotten a crystal of immunoglobulin. Another group did that structure. Also, what was happening was that the technology of crystallography, I told you I had been interested in the programming, was becoming somewhat more pat in those days. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of room for innovation, although now, of course, that was wrong. And I was looking for something else to do. And Jerry at that time was getting interested in studying the brain. He had kind of come to the end of what he wanted to do with immunology. And so we talked a lot, and he said, well, why don't you program a model of some of the ideas I'm writing about. He was writing a book with Vernon Mountcastle at that time called The Mindful Brain. And so the first model I did of something to do with the nervous system appeared as an appendix in that book, of all places. And then we went on